So we turn to the question of worldview, what it is and why you should care about it. A worldview is just a set of basic assumptions through which you approach everything. It might include answers to questions like what there is. That would be the metaphysical part of the worldview. It might include answers to questions like what is good. That would be the ethics part of the worldview. And to what we can know. That's the epistemology part of the worldview. Oftentimes, these assumptions remain only as assumptions. We simply operate under them and barely even notice them. But they're ever present, and they influence how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. You have a worldview, whether you know it or not, and so do I. We operate under these basic assumptions about what reality is like, what we can know, and what we should do. And it shapes everything we do. I think you can already see now why the question of a worldview, or selecting between different worldviews, might be very important. In fact, once you've conceived of things this way, it's hard to think of any intellectual task that is more important, because this task will control all of the other tasks. Intellectual, spiritual, emotional, personal, and otherwise. Your basic assumptions about what there is, what's good, what we can know, will inform everything that you do. And this has been our task in life, the universe, and everything. We have not done this systematically. We've instead done it piecemeal, taking off one little question here, one little question there, and thinking about one little argument for one little answer to that question. But I'm drawing your attention now to the broader task. You might wonder how we could, in fact, select between worldviews. After all, aren't they just assumptions? It's a good question. Let me suggest to you two tests that we might employ here. The first is to test for internal consistency. The idea here is that you maybe can't know that a worldview is right, but you can certainly know that it's wrong by finding that it is at war with itself. If it is inconsistent or self-referentially incoherent, or in some way makes it unreasonable to believe by its own lights. So this is one test. Let me give you some examples of what I mean by internal consistency or inconsistency. Sometimes we can just know that a theory or a hypothesis in philosophy is false because if it's true, it's false. Think about that for a second. A hypothesis that implies its own falsity must be false. Because if it's false, and if it's true, it's false. Here's an example. There are no English sentences. By its very existence, this sentence shows that it is false. So this isn't one of the cases where if it's true, it's false, but if it exists, it's false. And you can know that just by looking at that sentence and reflecting on what it is. You can know that it is not true once you notice that this sentence, in fact, exists and is a sentence of English. Here's a more substantive and philosophically interesting sentence. There are no truths. Maybe you've heard people say things like this. Apply the test for consistency. And notice that if there are no truths, then this sentence is itself not true. So if it's true, it's false. And of course, if it's false, it's false. One cannot, under pain of inconsistency, affirm sentences like this. Here's a slightly more subtle one. No one has good reasons to believe anything. If this is true, then no one has any good reason to believe it. So these are kind of obvious examples, blatantly inconsistent or self-referentially incoherent. Let's keep an eye out, though, for perhaps more subtle cases of this phenomenon. Theories such that, if they're true, they undermine themselves in some important way. So that's one test for a worldview, is internal consistency. Another one is external consistency, that is with the evidence that we see. We live, we experience, we observe, we gather new evidence, and we compare that evidence to what the worldview might predict. This is a procedure that we've been applying in specific cases with respect to the God hypothesis. But you can do it with respect to any hypothesis, even one of these big picture worldview hypotheses. Building or modifying or tinkering with or examining one's own worldview is an odd thing to do, in part because it's kind of like engineering or modifying a plane while in flight. You're tinkering with your basic assumptions while using those assumptions. This is subtle, difficult, and somewhat perverse. But it's what we do when looking carefully at our own worldviews. And this really is the point of this class. At least this is what I would like the point to be for you. I'd like for you to gain experience in thinking about these big questions for yourself, examining the evidence for and against, and tinkering with your own worldview to make it more coherent, both internally and with respect to the evidence. My goal is not for you to come to agree with me. Lord knows, we don't need more people like me. It's not to agree with some famous scientist or some other philosopher I like. I want for you to grow better at doing this for yourself. That's it. So we turn to naturalism, a perennial worldview. I'll say something about what it is, why people like it, and then raise a few puzzles for it. Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist and public science educator, especially active in the 80s, wrote a number of great essays which became a book and a television series called Cosmos. And this is the first sentence. The cosmos is all that is, that was, and that ever will be. I think this is a nice expression of the metaphysical component of what we'll call naturalism. Look around us. We find all these physical things. That's all that was. That's all that is. That's all that ever will be, is the thought. So here's a more official definition. The cosmos is all that is, was, or ever will be. And what that means is that everything is or is made of items treated by the natural sciences. Take a look at that definition again. We've defined naturalism in terms of the natural sciences. You might wonder, is there a kind of bug here or circularity? Do we actually understand anything about what this view might be? I actually think that it's not that big of a deal. We can fix it by defining that key term, natural sciences, just by example. The natural sciences are sciences like physics, biology, chemistry, cosmology, perhaps others. So those are in, and here's what's out. Unnatural sciences like astrology or theology. These differ by their method, but also their subject matter. So when we say with the naturalist that the cosmos is all that is, that was, or that ever will be, we're saying it's the items treated by those sciences, things like physics or biology or chemistry, and nothing more. We could think of this procedurally. Look around. Imagine you had all the time in the world, and you could look at every little thing and every big thing and every medium-sized thing. Make a list. What will you find on the list? Here's what the naturalist says. You'll find electrons and fields, maybe other kinds of particles, up quarks and down quarks, cells, ion channels, maybe space-time itself, minerals, acids. Things made up of those things, so not just ion channels and acids and proteins, but also organisms. Those are treated by sciences like biology. And then nothing else. That's it. The cosmos is all that was, that is, that ever will be. And that's it. This is an old view and a perennial one. It just won't die. So here's this old guy who I quoted last week with an apocryphal quotation that may or may not be something he said, but he definitely did say this. This is Epicurus in a letter to Herodotus. The totality is made up, that is, all of existence is made up of bodies, physical things, and the void, space-time. Beyond these two things, nothing can be conceived, and the atoms move continuously for all time. The atoms, the stuff inside space-time and space-time, that's all there is, according to Epicurus, according to other naturalists. This is, again, a very old and perennial view. And here's the vibe of the view. Our world is disenchanted. It does not contain ghosts or spirits, gods, ectoplasm, immaterial souls. And there's no heaven and no hell and nothing else awaiting for us outside of the cosmos, because the cosmos is all. A disenchanted world. No magic, No force. No force beyond, of course, the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force and gravity, but no Yoda-style force. Accordingly, everything that exists is governed only by laws of nature. So other forces one might imagine, karma, no such thing. Some grand metaphysical force that bends the arc of history towards justice? No, cannot. No star magic, astrological forces imposing grand cosmic meaning on our lives from above? No. Just the cosmos, and that's it. In Sagan's words, this is a universe not made for us, which is the name of a terrific essay he wrote on this topic, incidentally. You can find a lovely version of it with some music on YouTube if you search for Carl Sagan, A Universe Not Made for Us. Kind of a meditative, philosophical, scientific essay. It's about 10 minutes, well worth your time. I thought about playing the whole thing for you, but I've already made you sit through a song last week. I'm not going to do it again, but I recommend it to you on your own time. So imagine we had metaphysics classes. You put on these spectacles, and what it allows you to do is to see past appearances to what really exists. On naturalism, what this means is, so you look past appearances. There's all sorts of meanings we assign to the things that happen, forces beyond the laws of nature, mysterious or magical items, beings, purposes. Put on your metaphysical spectacles. They fade from view, for there are no such things. And what fades into view instead are the equations of physics and other laws of nature, those that govern biology, those that govern molecules, those that govern the cosmos itself, like the cosmological constant, or big equations, and that's it. We can extend the basic picture of naturalism, and many do, in this way. So the metaphysics says the cosmos is all that is, all that was, all that ever will be. The ethics part adds this. Well, what is good, or what is intrinsically good, as we've asked in this class? And the answer is, well, whatever it is, it's only the kinds of things that science can actually treat. One pleasing answer might be pleasure. This is not the goodwill of a god. This is not the governing force bending history towards justice. It's not some idea of justice. What is intrinsically good in this idea is just pleasure. Pleasure of organisms and perhaps of other living beings. And the epistemology side of this extended naturalistic worldview says this. What can we know? What science teaches us, and nothing more. Do you get the vibe? It's a science vibe. That's what naturalism is all about. I think you can probably see some of the appeal of a worldview like this. Science has made great progress within our lifetimes, before it, and I predict after our lifetimes too. Naturalism has a kind of simple austerity to it as well. And for those who are annoyed or befuddled or confused by talk about gods or demons or grand cosmic astrological purposes, naturalism gives us a nice tool. We simply say there are no such things. So this weird stuff, this spooky business some people want to talk about, you simply deny that it is altogether. Problem solved. Well, there are problems for naturalism. I'm going to raise these not to try to convince you not to be a naturalist, but rather to help us get a better feel for the view's commitments and to help us see why somebody might turn instead elsewhere. 3 classic problems for naturalism. One concerns us. There is something it's like to be you. You think, you feel. You see colors. You hear rich sonic tapestries. You can taste. But no matter how closely we look inside your brain or your nervous system or elsewhere in your body, we won't find feelings or conscious experiences We'll find things that cause conscious experience. Sure. The firing of neurons here, muscle bursts over there, C fibers firing, and so on, as when you're in pain. But it's kind of hard to actually find consciousness if we limit our worldview only to the things treated by, for example, physics or chemistry or biology. Now, as I've said things thus far, this is not an argument against naturalism. This is just a gesture at one kind of problem that naturalists have worked on for a very long time, trying to locate us within this world not made for us. Another problem stems from morality. Suppose there really are things that we should do and that we shouldn't do, things that are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. Suppose also that naturalism is true. Why might these things be good or bad, right or wrong? Not totally obvious how to answer a question like that. So it's not totally obvious how to locate or find morality within a broadly naturalistic worldview. You could, of course, abandon morality altogether and say there is no such thing as right or wrong. Or you could try to identify right or wrong with some property within the naturalistic worldview. These are both hard things to do. A final problem for naturalism concerns its epistemology. It seems that we know things. Yes? You know where you are right now, for example. It seems that we know things. But if a worldview implies that we don't, or otherwise makes false claims about epistemology, this is bad news for that worldview. Let me give you a small specification of this kind of problem. And again, my goal is not to persuade, it's to exemplify the kinds of things that drive people to look elsewhere. And it stems from what I'll call empiricism. So this is part of what I called extended naturalism. In answer to the question of what we can know, it says this: knowledge comes by way of natural science and natural science alone. You've probably heard people say things like this. Maybe you've thought them yourself. I'm going to raise for you a classic problem for the view, discovered in one form or other by Plato over 2,000 years ago. And it's plagued naturalists ever since. Do you know it? This is anonymous, so you can just take a wild guess if you like. Abstract knowledge is a good case. We know that 2 and 2 is 4, and yet we didn't find that out only through sensory experience or the natural sciences. That's one kind of problem. I don't upload the slides because I want you to be surprised sometime. Of course. I have to hide some of my cards. I can't tell you everything ahead of time. Berkeley would flip, correct. There are things that science cannot answer. Induction? You're all gesturing at important problems. This is not, by the way, a game of guess what the teacher is thinking. I just want to see what you're thinking. I'll tell you what I'm thinking, though. Empiricism, as stated, is self-refuting or self-referentially incoherent. If it's true, it undermines our own reasons for believing that it is true. Here's the argument. So first we assume empiricism. Knowledge comes by way only of the natural sciences. But take a look at that statement itself. Is this a statement that we can derive through experiments in physics, by looking at cells under a microscope, by doing cosmology? Cannot. This is not a statement of natural science at all. It's a philosophical statement. It's a statement that falls within epistemology, a subfield of philosophy, not of physics, and not of any natural science. So empiricism cannot be known by way of natural science, is the idea, at least, and not by natural science alone. There's something puzzling here, because empiricism fits in a vibe kind of way so well with confidence in the natural sciences with confidence that they'll continue to make astounding discoveries that are useful for engineering our world, maybe even ourselves. And yet, empiricism is not itself a deliverance of any natural science. It's rather an assumption made by some natural scientists and a doctrine of philosophy. You put these together and it follows that empiricism cannot be known. So one key element of extended naturalism cannot itself be known to be true. Well, hang on a minute. What are we doing putting stuff into our worldviews, making assumptions if we can't know them to be true? Premise 4 states that objection this way. If it cannot be known, then it shouldn't be affirmed within any worldview, and thus empiricism itself should not be affirmed. There's much to say about arguments like this. I'll say none of it. But you may on your own time do so. Here's what remains true. Naturalism is all the rage. This is a dominant worldview, especially in the West, less so where we are here, but more so within NUS than without on this island. Here's how Tom Crisp puts it. Naturalism is fashionable in Western academia. Its journals brim with attempts to give naturalistic accounts of the mental, the moral, the physical, and everything else. In some quarters, especially the sciences, to suggest that there might be non-naturalistic explanations of this or that phenomenon is to court professional disaster, to make oneself the target of vituperative accusations of intellectual sloppiness and irresponsibility. Perhaps you felt that when you read the reading for today about nature, spirits, and such. Naturalism in many sectors of the Western Academy has become orthodoxy. It's a basic operating assumption in much of the educated, developed world. Homework questions for you before we move on. Can you think of variations on naturalism? Fiddle with the parameters. See what you come up with. See how it manifests in real life. You are perhaps familiar with various ideologies at work in our world now. We might call them things like wokeism or communism or nationalism. Where do these fit within naturalism? Do they posit, for example, forces that cannot be studied by science? Materialistic or non-materialistic historical forces or systemic features that can't actually be seen? Are these more like religions, specifications of naturalism, or what? An open research question, in my opinion. The one thing to watch out, what are prevailing trends? By this, I mean things like, is religiosity or the rejection of naturalism in your own world as you live and see it, is that going up, going down, or what? Something to think about. Having thought about that, we turn now to an alternative, the denial of naturalism, supernaturalism. And this view says what you might guess. It says that in addition to the cosmos, there are other things. The cosmos is not all that is, that was, that ever will be. There are some items that are or are made of things not treated by the natural sciences. So think about that procedure that we identified before. Make a list of everything that there is. What will you find? Well, maybe you'll find things like souls, ectoplasm, ghosts, angels, demons, gods, nature spirits, maybe various forces. We are on magic or vibes territory here. If we want to state it just in 2 words. Our world is not disenchanted, it's enchanted. There is such a thing as magic or some other kind of mystery, a force or an entity or something else not treated by the natural sciences. Accordingly, our lives might well be governed by things like karma, star magic, divine intentions, and maybe other unscientific forces or assumptions. Secret forces at work in our institutions or across human history that can't quite be seen. This is not a universe not made for us. It's a personal universe, animated, perhaps throughout, by beings not studied by science that nonetheless have minds, intentions, and maybe even active causal powers. So what do you think? Do you believe in this stuff? If this were a small seminar, I would want to corner the people who said yes and get stories out of them. And here's my experience. Y'all have seen some wild shit. Naturalists, when seeing wild shit, must do this: explain it away. But if you're a supernaturalist, you need not explain it away. You can simply accept it and say, yeah, that's my dead great-grandfather. Why did the knife move, the ceremonial knife move, without anybody touching it? Well, it's because it's inhabited by the spirits of my ancestors, of course. Why did I get sick after doing something very, very naughty? It's because I caught a some sort of demonic infection when doing so, and so on. I know you have stories. I wish I could hear them all. But we're not going to do that right now. If we're supernaturalists and we put on our metaphysical spectacles, here's what happens. All this stuff, that fades away. And what fades into view instead is something a bit less manageable, a bit beyond our ken or our knowledge, a bit more mysterious, maybe even full-on magic. Now you laugh, but we already know that people in this room believe in this stuff, and people outside this room believe in this stuff too. And of course, as an EVP at Vibes Capital Management, I believe in vibes. That's not Executive Vice President, by the way. That is, I have to make this up on the spot. It is experienced vibrational practitioner. We're governed by vibes. Of course, as with naturalism, there are problems for supernaturalism. One pressing one is just this: what are we even saying? When we posit mysterious forces or beings beyond science, is it clear that we're saying anything at all? I'm not sure. Sometimes not, probably. It's a kind of black box without much content to it. And this contrasts sharply with what the scientists, or the natural scientists in particular, can do. When asked to explain things, they don't say, the demon put it there. They'll give you equations, and you need to learn some math if you want to disagree, which sucks. But at least they can give content to their theories. Harder to do in this case. It's not always easy to reconcile these supernaturalist views with the science that we do in fact know either. There are a lot of ways of making this problem more specific. I'm not going to discuss them here. And finally, there's just this question. Well, why would you believe in this stuff? What reason is there? What evidence is there to believe in spooks, ghosts, gods, demons, ectoplasm, mysterious cosmic forces, and so on? Not totally clear. A brief connection to draw between our previous 2 weeks of discussion and the present. We've discussed the hypothesis of theism, according to which there's a mighty God who made the cosmos, who's perfect, all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful. Theism is not the same as supernaturalism, but it does entail supernaturalism. So this is a subset of supernaturalism. And of course, it's a very important subset of supernaturalism. It's affirmed by roughly half the world's population, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion people, perhaps. So this is an important brand of supernaturalism, which is why we've spent 2 weeks on it. But now we're turning to something else, other brands of supernaturalism. And of course, arguments for theism are themselves arguments against naturalism and for supernaturalism. And there are other forms of supernaturalism too that might have other arguments for them. So here is a statement of the logical relations. Naturalism entails atheism. Theism entails supernaturalism, but supernaturalism does not entail theism. And we can put it as a Venn diagram too. Why? Why would you believe in mysterious forces or spirits or ghosts or demons? Well, interesting question, and we'll think about an argument that gives us an answer to it. But a brief discussion of the view, in view, first. We'll call it animism. And perhaps the best picture I can give to you of the view is the song that played before lecture, Colors of the Wind from Pocahontas, one of Alan Menken's finest melodic creations. The relevant lyric, well, I'm going to get this wrong just a second. Every rock, every tree, every creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. And as Pocahontas says this, as I recall, she touches a bush and it lights up like the spirit is present and visible even. This is a haunted or enchanted world. In addition to the cells within that plant and the acids and proteins and other little things going on inside the cells and the up quarks and the down quarks and the space-time within which they all have their being, there's something else. There's a spirit or a soul for that little plant. Sometimes these spirits have names. His name is Fuji-san. I don't know his name, but perhaps this waterfall is animated by a spirit too. So also this mighty sequoia. Does every living, or indeed every non-living thing, have a life, have a spirit as a name? Maybe not. We'll think of animism not as the thesis that all this stuff has a natural, or has a nature spirit, but rather at least that some of them do. So we can think of animism as a subset of supernaturalism that possibly overlaps theism, and it also overlaps atheism. It overlaps theism because you could believe in a mighty, perfect maker of the cosmos who also made angels and demons and other little tiny g gods. It overlaps atheism because you could believe that there is no mighty, perfect creator of the cosmos, but that there are small g gods. A little Zeus here, a little Fuji-san there, and so on. So what are these nature spirits? Well, they have minds. Like us, they have intentions, beliefs, thoughts, feelings, a mental life of their own, a conscious mental life. There's something it's like to be Mr. Fuji. They're embodied. So though they are spirits that inhabit material beings. They have a localized existence. There's a place and a time where you can find them, and they're not anywhere else. So unlike the sometimes said to be omnipresent God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, these kinds of small g gods are found in particular places, and only those places. Just this waterfall, just that sequoia tree. They're active. They can do things. Good things, bad things. They aren't necessarily perfect, unlike the God of theism, and they are to us, possibly at least, alien. And by that I mean their values, their intentions, may have nothing to do with us. Now, you might happen to intersect or interact with one of these nature spirits and find in unpleasant ways that it is not entirely alien to you. That is, if you start chopping away at the tree and then you get sick. Well, your values and that tree's values have intersected and clashed. But in the ordinary course of events, these beings are separate from us. Molest them at your own risk, is the general idea. Here's an official statement of the view, animism. There are nature spirits, locally embodied minds, causally active, imperfect or limited, non-human, and operating beyond the ken of natural sciences, beyond the scope, beyond the knowledge of natural sciences. Biologists do not study nature spirits. That's what that last clause suggests. And indeed, you might think of biology as typically practiced, for example, at this university, as an attempt to explain everything there is to explain about this little tree, or this little bush, or this flower, without appealing to nature spirits. We appeal only to ion channels and cells, and chlorophyll, and so on. As before, we can raise this question. We raised it with theism. We can raise it here. Well, isn't this just a matter of faith, not for philosophy? As before, I'll give you an answer. No. Think about the reasons that people have for affirming theism, the kinds of experiences that often make theism feel plausible or as a hypothesis to be considered, and I think you'll see parallel experiences. So this was quoted within the paper you read for today. Plantinga writes, "The marvelous, impressive beauty of the night sky." He's listing things that inspire people to believe in the mighty God of the theist. That night sky, the timeless crash and roar of the surf that resonates deep within us. He's really milking this. The majestic grandeur of the mountains, the ancient brooding presence of the Australian outback, the thunder of a great waterfall. And as Smith, the author of the paper we read today, points out, these very same experiences that undergird theism could quite naturally undergird animism as well. When observing the thunder of the great waterfall, you might come to belief and wonder and joy and love towards a mighty God, but you might also come to appreciate the might of the waterfall God right before you, whose body you can see because it is the waterfall itself. If this is right, there is evidence for animism. It can be weighed, it can be measured, and we can think about this as we did before, with a pro column and a con column, stacking up for and against, the reasons, the arguments, the items of evidence for animism or against. And here are some ways we might do that. We might go simply by experience. Why do I believe in the spirit of this little bush? Because I've seen him. Why do I believe in Fuji-san? Because I need him, the spirit of the mountain, to make sense of the world that I observe. Perhaps my shaman teaches me so. So we have learning through expert testimony. Or perhaps it's just frickin' vibes. An intuition, a sense, an unshakable conviction that there's something more to this world and not some mighty God posited by Judaism or Christianity or Islam, but instead something a little bit less. These are kinds of arguments that we might give for this brand of supernaturalism, for animism. But we're going to look at a slightly different one shortly. And note the parallels here. Before you poo-poo these arguments too quickly, let me just ask you this question. How do you know they're electrons? Well, is it perception, explanation, expert testimony, intuition? The list of evidences you can give in that case will start to look a lot like the list of evidence that animists might give in their case. So don't poo-poo this too quickly, is my suggestion, at least before we've thought about it in a little more detail. Now, here is one style of argument, and this is the one that's in view in a kind of surprising way today, which is an argument by common consent. The basic form of this argument is shockingly bad. It goes like this. Lots of people believe X, therefore X. You don't have to go to a philosophy class to know that this is a bad form of argument. You don't. It's famously bad. But why? That's an interesting question. That takes a little bit more care. That takes a little philosophy to figure out. And once we've done that, maybe we can raise this question. Are there, in fact, sound arguments of this form? Arguments from common consent. This is Tiddy Smith, or rather a book he wrote. I want to tell you about this fellow. He wrote the paper that you read for today, or that you were supposed to read for today. And he wrote some other papers about animism and related topics and edited a book. But a few years ago, he became obsessed with a murder mystery in the United States. He's a Kiwi, a New Zealand philosopher. But he became obsessed with this murder mystery that unfolded in the American South some years ago. A husband was eventually convicted, sentenced, served time in jail for killing his wife. But Tiddy Smith became convinced that the real killer was not that man, and indeed was no man at all. It was an owl. He wrote a book about this. I read the book. It's actually really good and really interesting. And Tiddy is absolutely obsessed with this. And when I saw that obsession, I had to love it, because he is to owls and owl murder mysteries as I am to Bitcoin. He can't stop talking about it. So also some of us and our other obsessions. So he's an unusual man with unusual interests, and he discovered something kind of cool and unexpected, which is that there is a surprisingly good argument for animism. Not just that, but an argument from common consent. So let's think about how that goes. First, look at why other common consent arguments are famously bad. He says this: any argument from common consent must be heedful of the way in which the agreement in question has been generated. Proselytizing theistic traditions, Islam, Christianity especially, typically generate agreement by a process of cultural diffusion. Although this can mean that such traditions become very popular, and indeed they are popular, billions of adherents, this also means that the agreement concerning the doctrines of such traditions might not be taken to be particularly strong evidence for the truth of their doctrines. Why are so many people Muslims? Well, because the people around them try to persuade them to be Muslims. Why are so many people Christians? Because the people around them try to persuade them to be Christians. The very fact that there's so many people within either of these traditions, billions, doesn't give us very strong evidence at all that those doctrines are true, because we can explain them without appeal to the truth. And in fact, it looks like there might be nothing there at all. No evidence there at all, because the sheer numbers can be explained entirely by proselytizing or other kinds of pressure. Social pressures to believe, to affirm, to practice religion, and so on. So that's one reason why arguments by common consent for, let's say, theism are famously bad. But let's look at this phenomenon in evidence, which we'll call independence. And we'll see why this makes for a different kind and a stronger kind of common consent argument. So consider this scenario 1. 100 reviews of course X. So we're on NUS Mods looking at courses. There's 100 reviews. They all say it's bad, and they're written by one student. Now, when you first look at this data, there's 100 reviews, you might be impressed. An argument by common consent. Lots of people say this, so it's highly likely that course X is very bad indeed. Once you learn that it's just one student, you're not so impressed by the evidence. And in fact, let's say it's one student who then persuaded all of her friends to write the same review. Equally unimpressive. Okay, let's beef it up. 100 reviews of course X say it is bad, and they're written by 100 students who all took the class in the same term, and they talk to each other. This is stronger evidence, but still not quite as strong as we might like, because they've all counseled together. What that's going to mean is that the independent signal from various students is mushed together towards the median. They've all agreed on one thing as opposed to giving their own specific experiences. So it's stronger evidence than scenario 1, but still not so impressive. Well, scenario 3, let's beef it up even more. 100 reviews of course X say that it is bad. They're written by 100 students who took the class across many terms and talk to each other. So not just one term, but many. Okay, let's change that variable, and we get scenario 4. 100 reviews of course X say it's bad, again by 100 students. They took the class across many terms, and none of them talked to each other. Independently, each student who took the course said, this sucks. The more students who say that, the more impressive that evidence is that you should not take this course, or if you must take it, that you should not expect much of it. So we have what I'll call the bad reviews argument. On the bad class hypothesis, according to which this really is a bad class, it's very likely that across space and time, people will independently come to reject that class. This is what you would predict if it really was a bad class, that students would be dissatisfied across the board, independently, without talking to each other, across many years. On the good or okay class hypothesis, according to which the class is good or okay, this is surprising. It would be very surprising that so many students independently, without talking to each other or without one student having a grudge and preaching to the other students that course X is bad, it would be very surprising to see so many independent attestations of badness. We make this observation by looking at NUS Mods, and so we conclude that the observation we've made is strong evidence for bad class hypothesis over the good or okay class hypothesis. This is an argument by common consent. We are making a conclusion about what is the case, whether the class really is bad, based on people agreeing or disagreeing with that conclusion. And the key variable here appears to be the independence of that opinion or testimony. Oh, an interesting example. The lesson here is that independent sources confer additional evidential weight. Corollary, independent alleged confirmations of a hypothesis confer additional evidential weight. And you can think of this if you want, especially if you're into social sciences, the way they conceive of hypotheses, confirmation, disconfirmation. You can think of those as replications. When somebody's tried to figure something out and come to a conclusion, and then somebody else has, without looking at that first person's homework, tried to figure things out and come to the same conclusion, it's like a replication of the experiment. And that itself is independent evidence for the hypothesis posited. So Tiddy says this: in contrast, when agreement between separate knowledge communities has been generated or sustained for prolonged periods, independently of any knowledge of others, this is good prima facie, that means on the face of it, evidence for the truth of the agreed upon claims. While it is true that animists are in the overwhelming minority, separate animistic communities have nevertheless come to agree about important religious propositions, while in a state of extreme historical and geographical isolation, one from another. And so we have the nature-spirit argument. Premise one. Near enough everyone, in near enough every isolated community, in near enough every historical area, independently agrees that some rocks, rivers, mountains, trees, have causally efficacious spirits. Whatever near enough everyone, and near enough every isolated community, and near enough every historical era believes, independently of the beliefs of outsiders, is probably true. And so animism is probably true. Some of you will find this argument to be interesting, plausible. Others, an absolute howler. I think I can see both reactions in the faces as I look out. Good. The very fact, says Smith, that animistic beliefs have been retained across so many millennia is nearly miraculous. One explanation for this retention over such an extraordinarily long period of time might be that animism is approximately true. Implicitly, Smith is using the same form of argument that we've used before, in the case of fine-tuning, in the case of the problem of evil, in the case of the class reviews argument. So we can put it a little bit differently. So we're stacking the evidence for and against, and we can remix the argument in this way. On the hypothesis of animism, it's very likely across space and time, people independently come to animist belief and retain it. So just suppose there really are nature spirits, and a bunch of people have independently tried to do these little experiments, talking to trees, for example, and independently, without talking to each other, causally isolated in some pretty radical ways. For example, some in Australasia, some totally different genetic communities that have virtually no relation for thousands of years in southern Africa come to the same conclusions, yet others in ancient Europe, and so on. Well, this is predicted by animism. Animism would suggest, if it really is true, that independent people trying to replicate these experiments will come to similar conclusions. Yes, there really are these spirits. So it's probable on the hypothesis of animism, but on the hypothesis of naturalism or some other alternative to animism, this observation is much less likely. People do indeed, and this is the anthropological evidence that Smith amasses in his article, come to animist belief and retain it. Therefore, we have strong evidence, or at least some evidence, for animism over some alternative, for example, naturalistic hypothesis. Here are our options. We could find an alternative, for example, naturalistic explanation of this widespread, independent, recalcitrant animist belief. Smith has discussed these kinds of debunking arguments. They debunk because they show that we can explain the data without appealing to the truth of animism. Or we could deny the anthropological evidence and say, no, in fact, animism is not either widely or recalcitrantly or independently believed in various human communities across space and time. Or finally, we could simply accept that this is some evidence for animism. And how much evidence is it? Well, you know the answer. It depends on those conditional probabilities. It depends on how probable this evidence is on the hypothesis of animalism versus some competing hypothesis. So the bigger the difference is between those two conditional probabilities, the stronger this evidence is. That is the evidence of recalcitrant, independent, widespread animist belief across space and time. What do you think? Write me a 30-second paper. You can take your time on this one. I don't think it's similar to the argument on moral objectivity. I did switch slides fast, but that's because I know that you have the videos to look at later. Evidence but not proof. Good distinction. This would not be a proof. I agree. Philosophy is basically nothing but cheem words. That's all we do. But in fact, that's what academia is, isn't it? We take perfectly ordinary things and we replace them with fancy words. Okay, now I see the connection to the moral objectivity argument that some people presuppose supernaturalism. That's a cool argument. Nice thinking. I like that connection. Let me out. You're free to leave at any time. Yes. That is, I'll give you Bitcoin for great stories. Of course. Inside you are two wolves. Be careful which one you feed. Outroduction. Let's wrap things up. We've considered worldview at the level of belief, wondering, what should our opinions be? What should our thoughts be? What should we believe when it comes to these big questions? But there's something else too. There's the question of action. What to do? It's the practical question. Next week, we will work towards that practical question by thinking about an argument not from probability theory, but from a related field, decision theory. And this will be the wager argument, not quite for belief in God, but better for attempting to believe in God, taking action. This will be a case study through which we'll think about that other question of worldview selection. Now, I'm going to end not with advice, but in fact with a command. So listen carefully. This is an order. My order is for you next week on Tuesday, which is, what day is Tuesday? It's Well-Being Day. And this comes from the big man himself, President Tan Chai. My order for you on Well-Being Day is to be well. So, what will you do next week on Well-Being Day? You are a bad, bad boy or a bad, bad girl. That was not a request. That was not advice. Are you going to disobey President Tan Chai? He said to be well on Tuesday. Please do so. And I'll see you next week. Cheers.